Good morning. So I don't know how to follow up against the backdrop of what we just heard. So if you were here for the last presentation, I'm going to be nowhere near that exciting. I am long-winded. I can stand up here and just tell jokes. If you want to do that, we can go that route. But I did want to talk about infrastructure-based security. This is, while there are technical elements to it, it's not primarily a technical discussion. The idea is to kind of come out to a call of action as we look at the historical view of where we've been and where things are going and kind of the confluence of a number of different factors. This is aimed primarily at an executive level, right? So how many of you are security practitioners? Okay. How many of you are actually, you sit on you're either a director, a VP, a board? Okay. And so, thank you. How many of you are just your closet hackers? You just sit home and you don't even have to be in the basement. Okay. Well, good deal. I'm just going to set this up here. Make it nice and annoying. Everybody's going to look at the bottle instead of me. Okay, so I'm gonna get started here. I'm a little long-winded, so I'm going to tell you that up front. I get a little excited and probably, like the previous speaker, probably lean towards the thespian a little bit. I do want to talk about infrastructure-based security. So as we think about this, I want to reframe the conversation. The first element of this is, in the United States, one of the elements that we have, right, that we've kind of taken advantage of, is this embedded infrastructure of wireline technologies, right? So wireline technologies is the cable in the ground, right? It's the fiber, it's the copper, etc. It's all of the nodes that distribute that capability. It's the systems, the processes, the people. There's an entire business and support infrastructure built around wireline technologies. And so we've had that for years and years and years and years. Correct? We agree? Other countries that were late to develop, relatively, right? Late to develop, didn't have that as an anchor, right? As much as that provided for the United States, it was also an anchor as it related to trying to determine what's the best method of distributing communication from one end to the other, right? Because they didn't have to look at that embedded base, right? So we're going to get into that a little bit. So before we do, we're going to talk about 3 trends that I want you to keep informed of. This should be something that you kind of keep in the back of your mind all the way through this presentation, because there'll be key elements of these factors that'll be pulled out throughout the presentation. So the first is that we're moving to the cloud. Is that a surprise? Right? It seems like every year we go one direction and then we come back another direction, or every so many years, right? So there was this idea of centralized monolithic power that existed in a mainframe somewhere, and we went from the mainframe or centralization to decentralization, and now we seem to be going back that direction. It's a $390 billion by Gartner. Gartner says it's going to be $390 billion by 2020 in terms of revenue. It's a shared security model, which means that they secure their infrastructure, right? You secure yours. Does that make sense? The issue here is you can go out and you can do a Google search for Rhino Labs. Rhino Labs did a case study on how easy it is to breach some of the cloud capabilities, and since that time, which was Rhino Labs did this, closing in on a year ago, the likes of Amazon and Azure, et cetera, have really tried to up their game, if you will, to try and ensure that they have a better security posture as it relates to allowing customer adoption to cloud, right? Because that's part of their revenue stream. So big deal there. And how many of you have cloud initiatives right now going on in your company, or you're advising on them? And you're well aware of the CAD. Okay, so plenty, right? So that's one. The other is $8.4 billion, or 8.4 billion IoT devices in 2017, as of 2017. 8.4 billion IoT devices, right? So one of the things that I like to point out here is, number one, obviously they're headless, right? So there's not like central management to these necessarily. There's no security inherent to those devices necessarily. In addition to that, they frequently run on operating systems that are no longer in distribution, right? Or at least in support, right? So there was one recently that they were running on an old flavor of XP, right? There's a breach associated with IoT, and the devices that were connected were actually running on an old XP version, which is obviously out of support and has a lot of flaws and vulnerabilities to begin with, right? So that's an issue. Patch management. A number of the different threats or breaches that have occurred here recently have all been, or have kind of traced back to patch management, the ability to do that. So you've got all of these devices, and you've got basically no security built into them, right? Virtually none. Recently in Texas, you may have read in the news, it's probably 6 months ago, someone hacked into, through IoT, they hacked into their emergency system, and the sirens, for the tornado sirens, went on for about an hour, hour and a half, where there was no tornado, right? So a little mayhem, right? Might be a little bit of cost associated with that, but nevertheless, that represents kind of the testing of what the capabilities are in terms of compromise. How many of you would agree with this? Right? How many of you are, so for those of you that are at the director VP level, or that you're involved, you're in a company and you're trying to get people to grow your team. Is your team in growth mode, by the way? Okay, some of you, I see a lot of heads nodding. Nobody wants to raise their hand. That's all right. Is it difficult to find good cybersecurity experts or engineers? Folks that really understand? Is that difficult? In my business, so what we do is we hire a lot of SEs, and I'm typically involved in some method of the interview process for the central region. I'm a principal engineer out of the central region for Fortinet. If you don't know Fortinet, if you're not familiar with Fortinet, we are by far and away the #1 security appliance vendor in the world. We've distributed more security appliances than anybody out there by a factor of 2. So it's not even close. We custom develop our own ASICs, et cetera. So we're in that space. We've been in that space since 2000. So I typically am involved in the interview process for hiring engineers. And I got to tell you, it is extremely difficult from my perspective to find these engineers. So when it's reported that there's an issue, when Gartner or Forbes reports that, hey, there's an issue with hiring cybersecurity engineers or cybersecurity professionals, I tend to agree, right? So those are the 3 trends, right? Number 1, we're going to the cloud, right? Cloud is still relatively untested, right? So we're going to the cloud, whether it's infrastructure as a service, software as a service, storage as a service, platform as a service, whatever that is, we're going to the cloud. We have hybrid cloud, right? We got our own back end, right? We're running VMware, Hyper-V, KVM, whatever you happen to be running, we're running that. We're trying to connect that to the cloud. So now all of our back end, everything that we use to derive revenue as a business is actually now tied directly into the cloud, right? And so we want to put security controls on that. And so the question is, how do we do that? It's important. I got a better question than that, which we'll cover here in a little bit. So number 1, we're moving to cloud. Number 2, we've got a lot of threat vector, or a lot of entry points, basically, that are attackable, right, from the IoT. And then, of course, we don't have necessarily have the skills available to us, freely available to us, to go solve these problems right away. So those are the 3 trends that I want to keep you in mind. Second, I want to frame the conversation with the historical view. This goes back to what I said about the embedded infrastructure. So think back with me for a moment, if you will. If you're in an industry where or an enterprise where you have your cybersecurity team and you have your infrastructure team, right? There's a little bit of tug of war that goes on there. There's some difficulties, right? Shall we say, to put it mildly, right? They have their goals and you have your goals, and they don't necessarily always mix, and you have different teams, different budgets. There's a wrestling match over who's going to get the biggest budget, who's going to be in charge of the firewall, right? There's all of that that goes on. Because historically speaking, right, at a minimum, historically speaking, we didn't build networks with the idea of security. Security was not even an afterthought, right? At least when it was built. The idea was end-to-end communication. And as it organically grew and we added more and more devices and more capabilities, more technologies, we were still of the mind that what we were trying to accomplish, right, was end-to-end availability of applications. That's really what we had in mind. And so we're all familiar with the old Cisco model of core distribution access, right, in terms of infrastructure. And so here's what we did. We wanted it to converge very fast, so we installed a router. That router might be layer 3, might be layer 2, might be layer 4, right? Could be any of it. We want to basically converge the network, and then we want to switch it very fast. And then, oh, by the way, because we're connected to the internet and there's this thing called security, we better have a door, a gateway, a block, something that keeps the bad guys out, right? You all have front and back doors on your house, right? At least a front door on your house, right? And you close, I guarantee you, every one of you at night, you go around your house and you make sure they're all shut, do you? Right? You make sure they're all shut and the windows are shut. And if you're a dad, and no offense, ladies, you could be doing this too. I'm just speaking from my own experience because I'm a dad. But if you're a dad, you're shutting lights off too, right? Right? Dad, I was using that. Anyway, so here's what we did: is we had this idea of closing the door, right? So this was the idea of closing the door. In the meantime, we're all safe inside, and we're trying to do end-to-end communication with this embedded infrastructure that is our routers, our switches, etc. Right? So basically, when we did implement firewall, that evolved a little bit into IDS, but we were mainly focused on applications, right? We're mainly focused on applications. How do we get end-to-end connectivity, availability, uptime of our applications, right? And basically the infrastructure guys, it's all about 5 nines, right? It's all about 5 nines. Can't be down, right? That's where the budget's got to go. Can't be down. And oh, by the way, from a security perspective, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? Well, it's kind of a synergy there, right? So that's what we had. And if we want to report, if we want to know what's actually going on, most of this was traps, SNMP, syslog, whatever. We generated some sort of report, and we put that together. The problem with this is well documented, right, is that it was all connection state oriented. It was based on signatures that are static. You have to download them, etc. And mostly what we were trying to accomplish still, even with firewall and IDS in place, was end-to-end application capability. And then it was application visibility. We wanted to actually see how this application performed against another, apply quality of service or class of service, and our MPLS networks, etc. We did get into a little bit of identity access, who's getting access to the applications, because what I don't want to do is have some streaming video choke out the bandwidth for my back office applications that actually generate revenue for me. Because heretofore, at this point, the internet was a big toy, right? It wasn't necessarily a revenue-generating tool, right? It moved that direction because, obviously, as communication capabilities expand, so too do the revenue generation capabilities. And, of course, we generate reports and get a little more sophisticated in that. So what does that mean? Is that it was all about speed, identification of applications, and doing some form of traffic management. So that's our embedded base. That is basically the anchor, right? For when we go in, if you're a consultant, if you're working at your place of employment, and you're trying to send the message that we need to do something different, this is the anchor. The anchor is all of this stuff that someone is protecting, right? Their team, their job, it all is supporting this, right? Do you agree? So security at that point was an add-on, right? So now we're going to talk a little bit. So we got some concepts in play. We're framing the conversation a little bit. We're going to frame it a little bit more. This is the conspiracy of the attack surface that I'm going to refer to. I have a nice little slide that's completely theoretical. It's all made up. It's my own. The idea is it shows a couple different axes, and of those axes, they're sophisticated and there's proliferation of applications and technologies and that sort of thing. And as more technology increases and as speed of the network increases, etc., what we have is the attack surface is growing exponentially. But when you look at the actual ability to mitigate any of the threats associated with that growing and expanding attack surface, it's all reactionary. It's all less than, right? It's not growing at the same rate. And so the attackers are the ones who are actually leading the pack, and the security practitioners are falling behind. So what do we do about that, right? So there's kind of the cry here. I just talked about the slide. You're going to enjoy the fact that you will not have to see that slide. It'll be great. But the idea here is kind of similar. It's that you have more and more sophisticated attacks, and these attacks are partially the result of the fact that we have greater and greater speeds, more and more technologies associated. So the early attacker, right, was they looked at service-oriented stuff, and it was kind of weak passwords. How do I password guess? How do I crack something? You remember the old tools, the loft crack, and those sorts of things. And so the technology, the predominant technology at that point was mainframe. Then we got into a little bit of playing, a little of script kiddies and that sort of thing. And so now we wanted to be able to replicate. We actually wanted to attack an application and that sort of thing. At that point, we started to develop PCs and laptops, right? So more technology. Then we got more into the test level. Now, by this time, what we have here is we actually have, how many of you are well aware that there are actually black hat technologies that are available for purchase in the dark web? You can just download it and install it and run it. And if you actually have a problem, you can call their help desk, right? They have a whole Q&A, like this whole thing is available for purchase, right? So no longer do we need to be a script kiddie that has some programming capabilities and we're just a little bit on the cutting edge as opposed to the rest of the general user population. Now we actually can go out and buy a sophisticated tool and just employ it. What is it that we want to try and accomplish? And then we can go ahead and accomplish that with this off-the-shelf product. Sorry, I'm going to have to set my phone to stun. I should have done that already. Apologize. So that's where we're at here. And so now with smartphone and tablet, right, we're looking at real crime, right? Now, how many of you are actually on social media? Okay, how many of you lie to yourselves and say that the only reason you're on social media is because your kids are on there? That's how I got started too. It's a little addictive. Here's the thought. How many of you would announce, just think, what we don't do, what's funny, what I find like kind of these human experiments, if you will, is when you're driving down the road, you know what thought you never think? You never think, should I be driving? You never think that. You only ever think, should I turn left, right, straight? Do I brake? What do I do? That's what you think, right? How many of you, and so the idea is, again, this idea of embedded infrastructure, something that's holding you back, right? Something that's anchoring you. How many of you would actually announce to the world that you're on vacation and there's nobody home at your house? But how many of you have actually done that in social media, right? Or, you get the selfie, hey, I'm at GrrCON. And you get the selfie, and everybody knows you're at GrrCON, right? And then, so with all due respect to all of you people, I won't remember hardly any of you, right, in 2 weeks. But if someone sent me a well-crafted email that indicated that, hey, we exchanged business cards, and we were talking at the GrrCON event, that they figured out from social media, because I had a selfie, right, with the GrrCON, the well-crafted email, hey, we talked about this, can you send me your contact information? And by the way, this is my digital card. Go ahead and click here for my digital card, right? Exfiltration, according to the Verizon Data Breach Report, exfiltration takes seconds to minutes, right? Identification of those threats take much, much longer, and I have a slide on that. But the point is that what's holding us back is that we're already in the mode of doing something, right? We're already in the mode of doing something. And so because we're already in the mode, we just do it without thinking. We're just reacting. We're not really thinking about what we're doing. And we're announcing to the world that we're out on a sandy beach somewhere with no access to any sort of voicemail, email, whatever. And and our home is empty, basically. That's what we're doing. And we do that same thing with our network. We do that same thing with our infrastructure, with our applications, etc. The exact same thing. Whether we do it on social media, right? Or whether we do it in casual conversation, because now we have these little computers that sit in our pocket and we're taking pictures and we're showing around and the whole deal. That's what we're doing, in essence, right? So that's the conspiracy of the attack surface. In addition to that, if you're not familiar with this, please consider this, right? So you have the core, right? Your campus environment, your wide area network, your access. These are the various domains, if you will, of your infrastructure. And then you have basically what amounts to a borderless network, right? The idea here is that how do you create those trust boundaries that are relevant? Right? Because before, with the add-on, what we did and what we continue to do today is we have technology and we basically just layer it with our over our infrastructure. That's what we have. And so it's not a well thought out plan. It's just who's got the Gartner Magic Quadrant, best of breed technology, and let's put that at the edge. Let's put that somewhere. Where should we really put that? Right? How does that really play? Does it have this protocol, et cetera, et cetera? And that's what we really do. And so we're still protecting the perimeter. But the problem with that is that once a threat penetrates that perimeter, the inside of the network is extremely vulnerable. Threats can move laterally in the network basically uninhibited. Worse is when we think of the phishing attack that I just talked about, where someone sends me a well-crafted email. And by the way, if you think you're not susceptible, there's a book out there called, I apologize. There's a book out there called, all right, what's going on here? Fishing in Deep Water. It's called Fishing in Deep Water. And the guy, the author, I wish I could remember his name, and I apologize, I don't remember, but the guy who authored the book, basically, that's his job. He goes out and he warns enterprises that, hey, phishing is serious, it's real, and you need to do something about it, and the whole thing. He actually recounts how, on multiple occasions, he's actually, even in that role, been the victim of very well-orchestrated, very sophisticated phishing attacks. And when you have a phishing attack of that nature, that you're actually, when you're that skilled, right, that trained to look at, there are a couple of letters in the URL that are flipped, right? When you're that skilled at it and you can still be compromised, where does that leave the rest of us, right? Knowing that exfiltration takes, place so quickly. In addition to that, more often than not, because of social media, because of these sorts of things, these targeted attacks really go towards the C-levels, the executives, the VPs, the directors, right? And so when a log comes back and says, oh, the CIO accessed the database, for the customer relationship management, right? He accessed the database, right? Is that a big deal? It could be, right? Was it really him that did it? Certainly, he may have been granted access to it, right? He may have had permissions for it. So we have issues built into the way we have the soft underbelly, if you will, of the core of the network, which is a call for segmentation. Anybody working on segmentation projects? Have you heard your vendor come out and talk to you about segmentation? And is that an issue with the infrastructure folks? Any infrastructure folks here? Okay, so yeah, some infrastructure folks. Okay, so is that a problem? Is segmentation a problem? Anybody? It is, right? Because anything that doesn't give me 5 nines and slows down my applications kills my job, right? Kills what I'm actually trying to accomplish, my mission, right? Does that make sense? Do you agree? You guys are all sleeping. I don't have anything to throw out there or anything. So, right? And it's not just me saying this, right? Gartner's out there saying that in the core you're going to have to scale to 100 gig. How many of you have a 100 gig firewall? Raise your hand if you got a 100 gig firewall. 10 gig firewall? Okay, few. One. So everything else is less than that, right? So, little plug. Fortinet's the world's fastest firewall. We've had that tagline for a long time, right? It's based on ASICs, but that's not the point. The point is that you actually have to have extremely strong performance in your infrastructure if you're actually going to accomplish segmentation. And so Gartner's saying, hey, you got to scale to a gig, 100 gig, right? And so that means that vendors have to respond to that. They actually have to produce products that actually do that. They have to educate you, and you actually have to implement them, right? But then there's this, the tug of war. And the idea here, this call of action, is actually to try and help frame the discussion around this tug of war to eliminate the tug of war. The next thing that they're talking about, you got to do segmentation. And finally, one of the most critical components here is that you actually have to do deep packet inspection. Are any of you doing deep packet inspection? Anybody talking about deep packet inspection? Familiar with it? Okay. So the idea, just because of a limited show of hands, let me explain very quickly. So the idea is that you may trust NewYorkTimes.com. Some of you may not, right? But in all likelihood, when you do an IP reputation test against NewYorkTimes.com, it comes up good, right? It's a trusted site, right? And by the way, you might have a subscription. When you have the subscription, you connect via SSL. And the reason you connect via SSL is because we're all about privacy. We all want security for our browsers and that sort of thing. And we want a secure communication setup. And so PKI and that sort of thing is a beautiful way of making that happen, right? Asymmetric keys and symmetric keys and all that good stuff, right? It's a great way of doing things. Now, New York Times has been compromised numerous times, right? And malware has been found on NewYorkTimes.com numerous times over the course of the last 10 years, right? So while you're allowing that connection and someone connects to NewYorkTimes.com and they click on a particular link because they want to see the latest in a particular news headline, they download malware. Now you might say, well, I've got AV right at the gateway, or I've got IDS, I got whatever, I got all these things. Well, that's great. The trouble is it's an encrypted connection between the server on the far end and the client at the local end. So whether you have that stuff or not doesn't matter. It just got in undetected. And the reason it got in undetected is because you're not doing deep packet inspection. It's a tube, right? It's a dark tube, and there's no way to determine what's going through that unless you're at the client or the server level, right? So SSL inspection becomes critical, especially as I've done what we call cyber threat assessments. A cyber threat assessment is where we go in and we drop an appliance and we basically uncover all the issues that your current security infrastructure is not finding, right? And it ties into performance, right? So it's not just about security vulnerabilities and that sort of thing, but it's also network availability and uptime. There are capabilities built into the box for that. So we do that, and what we invariably find is that roughly 60% plus of enterprise traffic is encrypted, right? I had one organization that they intentionally encrypted their entire core. And the reason they encrypted their core is because for security reasons, right? They didn't want anybody to be able to just sniff the wire. The trouble is with nobody able to sniff the wire, nobody was able to inspect the threat that was traversing that network. And so they were getting infected, and nobody could do anything about it because it was all encrypted. Nobody could see it until it reached the endpoint. Make sense? Right? So SSL inspection. So it's not just me saying this, it's not Fortinet saying this, it's Gartner saying this, right? It's third party. Now, incidentally, I will throw in another little plug. If you're familiar with Gartner, great. Gartner is a great paper evaluation of products and technologies and that sort of thing. They interview a lot of people, they look at what trends are and that sort of thing, and they make a recommendation off of that. There's another third party out there that does these same sort of magic quadrant type deals. It's called NSS Labs. Are you familiar with NSS Labs? Okay, let me tell you a little plug about NSS Labs real quickly. NSS Labs has this thing they call the Cyber Advanced Warning System. The Cyber Advanced Warning System is where they take all of the top vendors, they place them in a rack. They take the same in the wild live threats that exist today, and they throw them all at this rack of gear to determine the effectiveness of those devices. So it's basically a put your money where your mouth is kind of test, right? To prove out whether or not they actually block the threats that are in the wild today. I won't even get into how many of them fail the test miserably, right? But you can go out there. There's a Super Bowl of tests. They do it once a year, and you can see that. The Cyber Advanced Warning System is day in, day out. In which case, you get two main things to identify. One, how effective overall is the solution? And number two, if there's a breach or something does bypass that security, how quickly do they respond? Those are the two things that are pretty important in this, right? And so you find that with Cyber Advanced Warning System. Right? Now, real quick plug, Fortinet's been #1 since 2015. So there's a shift in approach, right? So just again, keep in mind, there are better ways to evaluate equipment. It's not just whether or not Gartner says it's good. Test the gear. Test the gear. Make sure it does what it says it's going to do. So here's the shift in approach I'm calling for. And this is where, this is actually where the presentation hopefully starts to get a little good. No laughs. All right. So historically speaking, we've been thinking about prevention, right? So think of the anchor. We're thinking about all this prevention. How do we stop the threats from getting in? How do we stop? And all of that is connection and service oriented. We've got our firewall. You may have a next-gen firewall. You may have IDS, IPS. You might have whatever. You might have the good stuff, right? You might have defense in depth. You might have all of that. That's great, right? But the trouble is that we need to move beyond that to the point where we're actually talking about intelligence-oriented security, threat intel, right? I told you, you walk around your house all the time and you're shutting doors and shutting windows and turning off lights and all that sort of thing. Now, the idea of IoT, the idea of cloud, is that someone's putting up, as soon as you close one door, someone's installing a new one that you didn't know about, right? How do you defend against that? And the reality is at this point you can't, not specifically. Right? Not specifically, because that's what's happening. You don't make all the decisions, right, for your environment. It's either a security team or the infrastructure team, and somebody's bringing in their phone and they got their own hotspot and they got shadow IT and they're putting up, they're using cloud applications and you don't even know about it unless you got a CASB solution. And even the CASB solution, you got to do proxy, you got to do deep packet inspection, all of those sorts of things to ensure that your own employees are not exfiltrating data out onto their Google Drive, right? You've seen that. Somebody's going to get a pink slip, and so suddenly a lot of data comes from their machine, right? Or maybe you haven't seen that. I'll just tell you it exists. Okay? So we got to get intelligence oriented. We have to start looking at things in terms of behavior. How does it actually work? And that moves into SIM, the idea of correlation, the idea of sandbox, which is, if you're familiar with those technologies, the idea that we take your golden image, right, and we stand it up in this little environment, and we poke a file with a stick until it does something. Then we create a report that says it's either malicious or not, and then good sandbox units, what they do is they'll develop a signature associated with that particular malicious software, and they'll distribute that out, right? And so that's what we have to get to. And then, of course, what's the role of AI? And AI is seen in a lot of different companies. And at this point, one of the things that we see is that AI looks at there are two important factors in AI. You can't simply look at a file for whether or not it's malicious. That only gives you half the picture. Because a good file can be malicious if it's used in the wrong way, right? So there's certainly the negative side, which is the file a malicious file? Does it behave in a way that a malicious file normally behaves? It takes a lot of threat samples. It takes a great amount of research to develop that capability and actually come up with statistical analysis of whether or not it's a bad file. But then you don't want false positives, right? So you actually have to identify, what do good files look like? How do they behave? So you can see the shift from what we call a tuple. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it's the IP address, it's the port, right? It's the service that it's actually running. Service oriented, right? We move from the idea of a tuple to intelligence, right? Because historically speaking, we just said block this range of IPs, block this service, right? We didn't really look at, oh, well, port 80, well, we allow all kinds of services to come through on port 80. Now that the cloud just allows us to get access to anything via port 80, we just encapsulate it in port 80, we're all good. And you do allow internet. And by the way, a phishing attack, that's easy, because what we wind up doing is the connection is actually originated internally. And we, by default, trust all internal outbound connections. Right? By default, don't we do that? Not if you're a good security practitioner. You try and get least privilege and all of that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, that is the mechanism. That's what the attacker's counting on. And so we need to move away from that idea, the idea that it's hard and fast, associated with particular connections, and we need to move into more intelligent ideas. Is this normal behavior? Does the CIO normally talk to the CRM database? Does he do that? If he doesn't, red flag, right? Does the CIO normally, is he normally online at 8 a.m.? What does he normally do? What does his normal day look like? And not just the CIO, but anybody. Because the idea is as these attacks become more and more sophisticated and targeted, those are going to be the high profile risks, right? So essentially, as the attack surface gets more complex, what we find is that we need greater and greater performance to do the inspection, etc. So let me also talk about the NOC and SOC environment. So the idea is that you have your NOC team and you have your SOC team, right? And never the two shall meet, except in the fact that they all look at screens in order to determine what's going on in a particular environment, right? So I did a back of the napkin sketch of what it would cost roughly for an engineer, network or security, doesn't matter, to look at one screen, right? So here's the way the sketch works. $100 million company, 100 employees, right? So just easy round numbers, right? They get 2 weeks of training. They look at the screen for 10 minutes a day, and they stay up with the technology for 10 minutes a day, right? You normalize that against the revenue stream, and it costs roughly $227,000 a year for that one screen to be looked at, right? But you're going to say to me, well, who does that? I mean, nobody normalizes, this sort of stuff across the entire revenue stream. Well, I would argue that you have 100 employees because they're all trying to drive revenue, right? Even the customer service folks, if they're not doing their job, it's a hit on revenue, right? But you could make the argument that, well, that's okay. It's a smaller amount of revenue, right? It's not a big deal. We can fix that, right? We can overcome that. Okay, so let's normalize it again against the salary. Let's say that engineer makes 100 grand a year, right? So he makes 100 grand a year. In that case, it costs about $10,000 annually for that, right? That's one screen. One screen, $10,000 annually. That's only 10% of his salary. Not a big deal, right? $10,000 per screen. Are we making money? So average number of screens, 32. Now we can rationalize again and say, well, I got a lot of guys, and we've each got only one looking at one screen or whatever. At the end of the day, what this points to is complexity. The inability of anybody to actually identify what's going on at any given point, communicate that upstream, and then actually do something about it, right? So I give this little example. Here's the idea. The idea is a thief comes into this room, right? And a thief actually creates a victim by stealing something from one of you. Now that person might be very offended. They might, turn around, look at the guy or gal or whoever it is and say, aha, I see there's a thief here. And then, they know all about it. They can give you a description, the whole deal. They can tell you exactly how it happened. Came up from behind me, stuck something in my back, and I reached in my pocket. Whatever it is, right? If the guy makes off, right, takes off running, well, nobody else in this building knows what that thief did, that he was a thief, what he looks like, any sort of description at all, right? So he got away with it, right? So the idea here is that if we all had the same information simultaneously, where there was a thief and the thief tried to make off, but everybody in the building knew what the thief looked like, that they were a thief, and how that crime got perpetrated, what's the likelihood that they would be caught? It would increase, right? Makes sense? Would increase? Okay, good. So there's a call for a new approach. Here's what the call for the new approach is, right? It's got to have visibility and control. That's done and done. We expect that, right? Got to have better visibility of your applications and what's going on in the network. We have better control of it. That's good. That's a great conversation starter. We can go a little bit further than that, and we can say, like David Oltovich says here, we need powerful tools. Right? Because if we're actually going to do this, we're actually going to get visibility and control, and we're going to do this, we're going to segment in our network, or even in our VM environment, we're going to micro-segment our network so that we don't have host-to-host communication. We actually inspect that traffic, and we can set that up through orchestration and that sort of thing. If we're going to do that, we need really powerful tools. Well, now we're advancing the conversation a little bit. But our own Ken McAlpine, I think, says the best thing, and the best thing is automation. right? If you're thinking about security and you're thinking about trying to mitigate risk, what you have to do, number one, I'm going to call you to assume the breach. Assume that the breach already took place, right? There are examples after examples of companies that have been breached, right? So assume the breach. So really what you're trying to do is shrink the time between the time you've actually detected the breach and the time to full remediation. You want to shrink those two things. So you need automation. That's really the key. So how do you get access to automation? And that's what we're going to get to. So borderless network, slow is broken, right? Complexity is the enemy of security. And so for that, you need, number one, you need a broad capability across your entire infrastructure, right? Not something that is bolt-on, but something that is built in. Two, you need superior threat intelligence, right? One of the least touted but most critical components of information security is the very information itself, the threat intelligence. Knowing that the door or the window is there and that it should be closed. Who should be allowed in and who should be allowed out, right? And under what circumstances, etc. So threat intelligence. So finding superior threat intelligence. This is just a little plug for FortiGuard Labs to give you an idea what threat intelligence really means, right? This is a little bit of an eye chart. 1.2 million network intrusion attempts blocked per minute. Gives you kind of the range and the scope. I told you that we're already the largest distributor of security appliances in the world. Those serve as capabilities to feed back into the threat intelligence, right? And so we get better and better intel. Our AI capabilities are getting stronger and stronger, although they're not fully implemented yet or even commercially implemented yet. The function there is the same idea, right? Trying to stay ahead of the curve. But more important than even this is the idea that the way we implement the security, the way I say Fortinet, but I'm really trying to communicate in a broad level what you should be looking for, how you should be recommending solutions to your customer base, how you should be framing the conversation, how you should be talking about it. The idea is that we all need to have the same information at the same time, right? It needs to happen automatically. It needs to happen in such a way to prevent exfiltration to the extent possible, right? So that's first and foremost. And so how do we do that? Especially since you're not going to run out and buy FortiGear, right, for everything. You're not going to completely replace all your gear. So vendors know that, right? So what Fortinet has done is actually worked with our partners, like the Cisco, like the Brocade, like the Carbon Black, like the other vendors of that sort, right? Networking infrastructure as well as endpoint, as well as switching, etc., wireless, in an effort to provide a communication stream that allows us to instantly all know and have the same view of what's going on in the infrastructure, so that if you have that, you're not orphaning a particular investment, right? Hey, we just bought all Aruba APs. What can you do, right? And so we bought all Aruba APs, they're bought by HP, and then you get worried about that. But does that integrate, right? So how do you do that? Okay, so you need to have those components. Breadth of capability, strong and powerful, and then an integration with third parties so you play nice, right? So first it starts with the next-gen firewall. The next-gen firewall is going to give you the best total cost of ownership as it relates to specific capabilities that exist in the box. We're not talking about, it's a different way of looking at things. There's best of breed, right? And best of breed is going to say, hey, we've got all of the reports, we got all of these sorts of things, and Gartner says we're great. Well, that's great, but your total cost of ownership on that is astronomical. So what does that cause you to do? You undersize the box. You don't buy all the software packages. You don't update, right? You don't, the software license or the subscription service is expensive the next year, right? So what do? Right? You're basically tying yourself to an anchor. Now, I'm not saying that devices shouldn't be effective. Don't hear that at all. They should be effective, but they should also coordinate and cooperate with other devices. Best of breed they don't do that. And by best of breed, I don't simply mean effectiveness. I'm talking about a Gartner rating, right? I'm not talking about whether or not they're effective. Because if you've got the Cyber Advanced Warning System, you'll see what's called best of breed devices that are no better than 80% effective against the threats that are active today. Now, how's that? What's 20% of 18,000 threats? that you're just allowing through your environment. Because the best of breed device doesn't actually protect against it, right? So you move away from best of breed, you move towards, in this case, Fortinet sells next-gen firewall. The idea is the next-gen firewall gives you a better total cost of ownership. Secondarily, you segment your network with next-gen firewalls. I've got a case study that I'm actually doing. It's a customer who is that close to going out of business. They were breached. They had the who's who. They had and I'll name them, they had the Palo Altos, they had the Ciscos, they had the Kasperskys, they had, Alien Vault, they had SIM, they had all the technology was in place, yet they were breached, and none of the technology actually did anything to really stop or thwart the breach. And what's worse is none of the vendors actually came in to help them. What we did is we got on site, we put our box in transparent mode behind them, identified what was going on, blocked it, helped them remediate, and spent a considerable amount of time talking to them about their infrastructure. And so segmentation is a critical component. They're replacing their 6509 switches with very large firewalls for that segmentation to protect the high-risk assets, right? So segmentation, right? If you're doing e-commerce, secure mail gateway, right? You have those capabilities. Fortinet has those devices as well. I'm not saying you have to do Fortinet. I'm saying that this is an important component of the overall infrastructure, right? Your endpoint. Now, here's the coup de grace, right? If all of these devices could talk to each other, right? And I'm going to get into the microsegmentation as well. If all of these devices could talk to each other at the same time and say there was a threat, right? And from a single screen, you could, with a right click, not only quarantine that threat, send the file automatically sent to your sandbox determines it's malicious, it sends a signature out to every one of these devices that I just talked to you about, right? Integrates with third party, and then automatically creates that block, that ability to stop and remediate, right? And with a right click, you can quarantine. Who did that person talk to? Give me instant visibility and reports on who that person is or what that attack looks like. Immediately drill into the logs from a single screen with just a couple clicks. Does that change the game any? Does it change the game, the fact that instantly your edge, your perimeter, your core, your endpoints, your web app firewall, your secure mail gateway all have the same exact view of what's going on in the environment? Basically, you've turned the lights on in your network. And of course, the linchpin, the sandbox, the capability, whether it's cloud or infrastructure-based, right, is the linchpin to try and determine how to shrink the gap. You're trying to protect a revenue stream. How do you protect the revenue stream? From the time that there's a breach to the time that it's remediated, you shrink that time. Think of the last presentation if you were here for the last presentation, right? There was an event took place. How quickly do you come up with an answer? The more time you save, the more potential answers you can come up with, right? How many of you play video games? All of you. Let's just be honest. There's probably a few of you don't. It's more of a teenager thing, but a lot of people do. Here's the point. You ever reach that moment in the game when you did something you're like, I should have done the other thing. And boy, if I was in the same spot again, I could have done whatever, but you ran out of time. You ran out of time. That's what happened, right? Same idea here. Shrinking the time. SD-WAN because it's a buzzword, right? But it's already built into the box, right? Identity access and that sort of thing. Why else do I talk about SD-WAN? I'll tell you why. Because access devices like Ethernet, access devices like Wi-Fi, you've heard about crack, I'm sure. These devices are commodity. There's no value in producing another switch in the sense of Ethernet connectivity. Everybody can do that. You can go to Micro Center and get a D-Link switch. You can get, Linksys, all that. I mean, you can get whatever you want, right? That's commodity. Same with wireless. You got that in your phone. The real question is, how do you secure it? That's the question. And what I'm trying to tell you is that the entire picture together, right, working together, is a stronger security posture, right, than a bunch of devices that cost an awful lot of money, that don't work together, that ultimately you're not going to fully utilize because you can't afford it. What's the call from the security practitioners all the time? How do we justify the budget? How do we justify the budget? Well, here you kill two birds with one stone. So you get segmentation, you get correlation, and you get automation. I'm going to go through a very quick case study. Anybody interested in a case study? Otherwise, this is really kind of the point of the presentation. You want to go through case study? See what it looks like in the real world? Okay. So this is an actual conversation transcript. So I have to, you're all, by virtue of the fact that you're looking at the screen, you're all under NDA. Right? And I'm going to take a picture. I know who you are. This is the conversation transcript. Go ahead, read carefully. It's difficult to discern. That's the laugh moment. Come on, guys. That's the laugh moment. We have a very particular set of skills. So that's what happened, right? They had all these vendors that didn't really help. Didn't help, right? They were there to collect the renewal, but they were not there to help when their device failed, right? That may not be the kind of vendor or partner you want to work with. So what was their architecture? Oh, they were good little infrastructure people. They had their routing and their switching in place. They had a wide area network, right? Fully redundant. Internet, fully redundant. They had their remote locations built like little mini headquarters, fully redundant, right? So the availability side, they were golden, right? And they VPN through the internet, right? Like good security folks. That's what they do. They even had two-factor, right? Two-factor deployed. And here's some of the vendors that they had. I'm not going to, label. You can figure out who some of these vendors are, I'm sure. But they had kind of the who's list, right? So they had the whole idea of defense in depth. They had best of breed, Magic Quadrant. They were using stateful firewall. All these things that you'd look at and go, wow, they got it, right? They're on point. But have you ever run into that person who's got all the skills that you would think would be necessary to be a great whatever? A great quarterback. Here'd be a great one. So Michigan. Trying to think, Jim Harbaugh, right? Great coach, right? Maybe. Used to be. You would think, right? So they got all the skills that you would expect, and yet at the same time, they were missing a few elements. They'd been breached. So what was the problem? And I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm nearly out of time. It comes down to people, processes, and technology, right? I'll let you read all of this, but here's the root. The root of it is they had some custom applications. These custom applications they never tweaked, touched, or whatever, tried to secure in any way. Unfortunately, they ran on legacy architecture. That legacy architecture was difficult to patch, difficult to maintain, right? They had to have availability and uptime of this application because it ran a number of things in their business, right? That was their revenue stream. They were already driving down the road not thinking, should I be driving this car? Right? Instead, they were driving down the road, and that's where they were, right? And so the idea is that when they did put in security elements, it was poorly implemented. There was a lack of deep technical expertise. There were communication issues. So even though they had the who's who, they had deployed all of these technologies and capabilities, ultimately, all of that conspired against them to be breached. And they were breached to the point where they were about that far away from going under. They hired a forensics team to come in and do some mitigation. And at the same time, just through relationship, they understood that the guy who's actually my director comes in and says, I've got a relationship here, how can we help? We get on site, we start to uncover all kinds of things. And an interesting thing, just a real quick aside, here's an interesting thing about IDS, IPS, AV, all of that sort of thing. The signature base is so wide. How capable is the box to actually cover the entire breadth of the capabilities to inspect for? Many boxes, especially the best of breed ones, right, they don't have the memory. They don't have the performance capabilities of that, right? And so they have a very small subset of very recent attacks. So a lot of these attacks were actually older attacks that should have just been, matter-of-factly dismissed. But instead, it was breached. Zeus was all over the place, right? What was the other? There's a few other ones there. Zeus was just one of them. Anyway, I digress. So what was the proposed solution? The idea is a fabric. We all know, we spray Scotchguard on something. We want some protectant inside the fabric of a particular element. We want to move. Think of conventional warfare. The idea that, in America, what we did against the British was they lined up in uniforms, perfect uniforms. And we were more guerrilla warfare, right? The idea is that we can move in and out without any problem, and they showed themselves very explicitly. So what does that do? When we look at fabric, why am I using that as an example? Well, the idea is that security has to live and breathe and move with your infrastructure. It has to be part of the infrastructure. And so that was the solution. And so this is what it looked like. They're wireless, they're switching, they're core, right? Their e-commerce, all of those platforms were not surrounded by security, but they use security elements for them. So as an example, part of their switch fabric was a firewall that controlled switches, a firewall that controlled APs, and could do all of the things that you would expect a firewall to do in the infrastructure. And so this is what it came out to be. And I will tell you that the CIO bought into this in no time flat, because what he realized is he had a real problem in his network, and if he was going to turn over the reins to someone else at some point, he's near retirement, he's going to turn over the reins to someone else. With the cybersecurity skill shortage, with the fact that there are all these new threat vectors and entry points, with the fact that we're moving to the cloud, they needed something much more comprehensive, something that looked automated. And that's what this is, and that's what I would recommend that you propose to your organization, or as you consult into those organizations that you're consulting into. Thank you.